Okay, couple of things. One, I know Leila and Julie are planning on bringing their own cars tomorrow. If you're planning to bring your own car tomorrow, be sure to see me to get a parking tab. Two, it is light rain right now. It's supposed to be clearing by 5, but if it is a little bit wet, I have 4 extra umbrellas. I don't know who gets them. Okay, Maria, just claimed it, so snooze and you lose. We've also had some other colleagues from our history department join us, so I'd like to introduce you to our graduate students, John Bachman and Leroy Myers, and my colleague, another historian, Warren Medka. We're glad y'all could join us. All right, we're into our last session for today, Understanding Indigenous People in Bison, Archaeology and Commemoration. Our first paper will be by Maria Nieves Zedonia, and our second paper will be by Genevieve Zuzumillo, and we're just going to let you go ahead and start.
Right.
Oh.
So, a few of you were intrigued about the fact that my paper has 4 co-authors. And, well, the reason is archaeology is a social endeavor. And you cannot do archaeology by yourself. There is no way. And the data that I want to present here, the archaeological survey and the fire analysis, are a part of these multi-year, very large projects that the University of Arizona had with the Blackfeet tribe. It's a collaborative research. The Blackfeet are very interested in knowing about their past, knowing about their origins, and making sure that the world know about their history and their practices and their culture in a scientific way. Not only in a traditional way, but in a scientific way. So I was responsible for the survey, and I was project director, and I had a junior colleague. Now he's graduated, then was a graduate student, Jesse Ballinger, who he and I put together the survey, and that paper has been published in Current Anthropology. Chris Rose is the super high scientist here. He is he's a geoarchaeologist and a pyroarchaeologist. Casey is the archaeometrist. Chris and Casey are a couple. And Casey was my student, in fact. She is now an assistant professor. And Mary Hagan is the long-suffering graduate student who had to process the charcoal samples that make up the big data of this particular paper. So everybody, in many others, my ex-student Brandy Bethy, she's here. My ex-student Matthew Pales, he also works here at the OU. They all participated in the project, so it's like a family enterprise. So fire in North America was a common occurrence throughout the Holocene and the late Pleistocene we found in this project. The climatic regime of the northern plains, in particular the cold, snowy winters and hot, dry summers, favored the growth of fescue grasses, the fescue province, given enough moisture could provide ample fuel for natural and anthropogenic fires. Yet the traditional scientific explanations of fires in the past have revolved around natural phenomena, discounting the fact that Native Americans greatly changed the surrounding landscape for their use and survival. For example, long-term scholar of indigenous fires, H.T. Lewis, recorded at least 70 different fire applications to manipulate people in nature, and they are summarized there in those categories. And then the bibliography of intentional use of fire under numerous circumstances across the globe and for our wide variety of purposes is growing really fast. I mean, there's a huge bibliography out on the internet by scholar, I believe it's George Williams or G. Williams, one of them. The most commonly mentioned uses of fire by historic plains bison hunters from George Colquitt's book, which I love, Pelican Empire. However, the most essential and enduring fire application was to manipulate the bison herd movements, and renew bison pastures. Historical ethnography and also contemporary elders indicate that fire was used to clear undesirable brush and young tree stands that were not too useful, to make room for useful plants such as berries, and to promote new grass growth in bison milling areas. As well, fire was an essential tool in bison drives. Bison runners or scouts would carefully observe the position of a herd relative to the intended jump or pound site. And a small fire was lit behind the herd so that when the herd became aware of the fire, they would naturally enter stone-lined funnels and run toward the pole. That is one such, there's actually two stone-lined funnels in that particular graphic. And you can see where the milling areas would have been far beyond. That is, the area that is colored is about 20 square kilometers. So the milling areas are farther apart. So any site that looks to you like a small insect legs is probably minimally 6 square kilometers up to 20 square kilometers each. So these are huge sites. They are massive sites. Hunters would line along the funnel to push the bison forward and discourage escape. Lighting the bison drive was imbued with ceremony, as well as other parts, were all other parts of the bison hunt. In 1832, for example, Prince Maximilian the Wit, or whatever it's pronounced, attended a Blackfoot Sundance or Okan ceremony and observed a ritual enactment of setting fire for the bison drive. In this enactment, and at the culmination of the 4-day dance, the Buffalo Women's Society, or Motoki, came out of their lodge, dancing as buffalo cows, while the attending crowd stood in a driving funnel formation in front of their lodge. And the Motoki Lodge was considered a ceremonial representation of the bison corral. Interestingly, it was made of travois poles. First dog travois, and then they switched to horse travois, which are a little larger. Important notes were also made by European observers about the knowledge and skill possessed by the hunters. Wind, weather, season, ecology, and astronomy, all came into place when attempting to locate and attract a bison herd into a kill site. And prescribed fire was a critical component of their ecological knowledge. Given the prevalence and religious significance of the interaction between bison hunting and fire, it is reasonable to expect that ancient prairie burning activities left recoverable remains in archaeological settings. Unfortunately, the archaeology of ancient anthropogenic fires is in its infancy. Modern paleoarchaeological studies have focused on various ecosystems across the country and over the world, but grasslands have received perhaps the least attention archaeologically, even though fire was such an essential component in grassland renewal. Part of the problem is the difficulty in identifying unambiguous signatures of anthropogenic fire activity. In a pioneering study of grassland remains from buried soils, Michael Boyd in 2002 published and demonstrated that as early as 2,400 years ago, bison hunters in Manitoba deliberately burned the prairie. He concluded that fire may have been used to manage bison herd movement and migration patterns, and probably out of just observing wildfires and the behavior of bison accordingly. And it made movements more predictable and may have enabled higher human carrying capacities, which is really important, and at the end you will see why. Boyd's study has huge theoretical and practical implications for reconstructing how bison hunters in the deep past, and any other hunters for that matter, developed an understanding of the delayed effects of their immediate actions, which in turn allowed them to plan for the future. Here, we're going to present the results of our paleoarchaeological study aimed at identifying evidence of intentional fire used by the late prehistoric bison hunters, called the old women's face in archaeological parlance, who were the immediate ancestors of the historic Blackfoot. The objective of this part of our big project was to demonstrate how bison hunters incorporated fire into their annual calendar. In other words, we were trying to use oral traditions about fire uses to inform our hypotheses about archaeology and how these sites operated. But let me first tell you a little bit about Blackfoot bison hunting practices, and from the archaeological and the ethnographic perspective. The Blackfoot groups encountered by the Europeans in the mid-18th century were specialized bison hunters. You can ask me what specialized means after I finish. Whose territory extended from the North Saskatchewan River in Alberta to the north shore of Yellowstone Lake in Montana, and from the Rocky Mountain front to the Great Sand Hills in western Saskatchewan. Although these contact period hunters had already adopted the horse by the time Peter Fiedler observed, a winter hunt in the foothills, their direct ancestors still drove bison communally and on foot. And that is what Peter Fiedler observed in 1790, funnels that connected bison milling areas to a steep bluff or cliff overlooking a river valley. Major drainages trended southwest northeast, and this allowed for natural and easy people bison movement, migration through the year, and then this terrain in turn was cross-cut north-south by coulees. And so it's a reticulated landscape that provides a lot of avenues for movement. So the sites were designed in such a way that they use the topography to actually move bison, to manipulate the herd, but also to prevent escape. And that is a really important and unique characteristic of the foothills, the upland prairies, as opposed to the upper prairie, where the vast majority of historic observations about bison hunting have been done. This kind of hunting was not really known or described by Europeans until much later. Bison jumps or kill sites associated with steep landforms were commonly located along the upper and middle river valleys, whereas bison pounds or corrals were situated in gentle terrain toward the eastern part of the territory. This is also seasonally, it's a seasonal thing. Bison and people wintered on the foothills and summered in the open prairie to the east. The glacial tilt covered Rocky Mountain foothills provided hunters with unlimited amounts of stone to build permanent is also a word that needs to be underlined, permanent bison drives, lodge foundations, effigies, monuments, and other features. To take advantage of the foothills topography, which is very interesting and is different from, let's say, Kansas, the Central Plains, where you can see far into the horizon, but you cannot see mid-distance. It's very poor mid-distance visibility because of the glaciated formations that are there. They took advantage of this topography through building these rock-like funnels and connecting bison milling areas that you saw in that slide of milling areas with a potential kill site. Sometimes these funnels connected two water bodies so that the hunters would be able to move a herd from one drainage to another. In between drainages, there was also glacial lakes and spring lakes that supported bison while they were crossing, milling around between major drainages. And interestingly enough, beaver had a big influence in this particular ecology. They had a really nice symbiotic relationship with Blackfeet in the sense that they were the keepers and the protectors of water bodies in different environments. So it's a no-brainer that the Blackfoot hold both animals in such high esteem, right? The result of this work, of these particular drivelines, was an intricate network of drivelines, sometimes actually difficult to interpret, and that crisscrossed the upland prairie strategically to bring bison to their death. Yet another important piece of knowledge that they applied to these particular sites was the fact that the fat content of bison males and females, young and adult, at different times of the year. Hunters aimed at obtaining, this is Judd Frink's research, hunters aimed at obtaining the greatest amount of fat, and therefore they targeted different sectors of the herd depending on the season. Intricate drivelines helped hunters split a herd and manipulate different sectors of the herd for this specific purpose. The ideal jumps were located above broad valleys where the floodplain was wide enough to provide enough room for a processing camp. That is the Katoyi site that we excavated for 3 seasons, and you can see that flat under the jump. And we through magnetometry, we identified close to 100 processing features, like heat features, that the magnetic equipment picks. And we excavated a sample of that, and indeed we found extensive evidence of pemmican making in the form of crushed bone, yielding and roasting pits, big crushing tools, berry mashers, and macroflorals of berries, which was the latest and the most exciting of things that we just found. The proximity to water and fuel were also critical for processing thousands of pounds of meat and dozens of hides. And they were communal hunting sites. They killed a lot of animals there. The largest hunts were in the cold months of the year, which helped preserve fresh meat until it was dried and turned into pemmican. And pemmican we consider to be a storage of surplus. And surplus storage is a really important indicator of emerging complex organization. And unfortunately, it has never been considered before by North American hunter-gatherer archaeologists as a form of storage, but indeed it is a form of storage. So bison tongues, which were a sacred food during the winter, were also dried for use in ceremonies and particularly in the summer Sundance. And it is because it's very difficult to hunt a lot during the summer because bison have such a high temperature that they rot very easily, right? And they attract immense amount of flies. In fact, I have excavated flies from inside of bison. It was not really pretty. The central Tumedicine River Valley, with its lofty bluffs and broad valley floor, offered the ideal conditions for building multiple bison drives. It was, in fact, known as the River of Bones in Grinnell and Schultz times. According to bison hunters' testimony, construction of multiple jumps was made by a band, owned by a large band, was strategic, and it allowed hunting bands to drive herds in a certain direction, depending on weather conditions, and to change plans on the fly if these conditions changed. The Catoyes archaeological project aimed precisely at reconstructing this specialized spatial organization from a perspective that highlights architectural investment on bison driving facilities along the Tumedicine River, which is a fairly large river. In this multi-year project, we focused on the geography of extractive localities that illustrate the bison hunting culture of the ancestral Blackfoot, precisely at the height of the large scale pedestrian communal hunting, which means between 1250 and 1750. After 1750, these pedestrian sites were slowly decommissioned. And you can see in the valley and how closely and tightly they actually correspond to this particular period. And these dates have been calibrated through Bayesian algorithms, which allows you to do a chronological hygiene, pull out the dates that are not 95% confidence within the 95% confidence interval, and also add certain cultural context in a stratigraphic record that do not have a direct date, but that because of the location and the percentage of charcoal and the kind of charcoal they have, they can actually be organized in a sequence, which is like a major advantage of this technology. A survey conducted by Thomas Kehoe in the 1950s revealed the existence of 5 driveline or jump clusters located on both banks of the Tumedicine River. Since then, the 4th cluster has been destroyed by agriculture, and the 5th cluster, which is at the mouth of the river, is only partially preserved, and the number 12 in the inset is actually at the mouth of the river where the Tumedicine join the Catwa and form the Morayas. Nevertheless, we relocated and carefully mapped with a GPS 11 jumps in 4 clusters and mapped the corresponding drivelands and associated encampments and other features on ceremonial. In total, we recorded 26,000 individual stone features, of which 24,000 are part of permanent hunting facilities. So, to assess the role of fire on Blackfoot land use and its relationship to the ecology of shortgrass prairies of the Rocky Mountain foothills, we use stratified records of fire and post-fire erosion from terrestrial sediments near archaeologically documented complex bison jumps. Here you can see how these particular profiles are actually look like, and you can see where they are charcoal layers embedded in alluvial deposits. My colleagues Chris and Casey clearly described and continuously sampled alluvial sediments from two small fan terraces in the Spring Coulee tributary of the Two Medicine River. Some charcoal and bone layers exposed beyond the edge of a bison bone bed at the Strangleworld kill site, and a relict sedimentary landform to the west of the Catalyst kill site. And here you can see the three sampling areas that are equidistant from one another. The charcoal layers of Strangleworld and Spring Coulee contain discrete, fine-grained beds that are rich in charcoal interbedded with colluvial sediments. That also is what you're looking in there. And fine-grained alluvial deposits as well. The charcoal layers at Catoyes, because it's a remnant landform, are not as well defined, but are nonetheless visible and datable and correlatable with these other sampling localities. To determine the age of these fire-derived deposits, we radiocarbon dated aggregated fine charcoal from charcoal-rich deposits, as well as non-fire-related deposits and soils for comparative purposes. We also did grain by grain. This is where the hapless graduate student have to help us by pulling individual pieces of charcoal to make sure that we were not aggregating charcoal from different ages. Radiocarbon dating was complicated by the fact that the source material for certain alluvial and colluvial deposits included glacial till that dated as early as the glacial maximum, 26 to 18,000 years ago, meaning that even back then there were still prairie fires, with or without people, we do not know. This meant that a few dates on aggregated charcoal were artificially too old and had to be removed because they had been carried in by the glacial till during the glaciation. Therefore, we excluded these dates, but in all, we obtained 19 ordered valid radiocarbon dates from 3 sampling localities. Of these, 10 are from discrete charcoal beds, and the remaining from non-charcoal soils that interbed with the charcoal, and also that bookend the fire sequence, meaning they are below, and you can see that date of 10,000 calibrated BC. That's the old gravel channel from where that formed the river during the deglaciation. So you can imagine how old that is. And to above and beyond, to the upper non-charcoal layers, which bookend the end of the fire sequence. Radiocarbon dates that are in stratigraphic order were calibrated using Bayesian algorithms. That I explained that to you. And then once we had all of those dates for fire and non-fire deposits outside the archaeological sites, we compared these dates through Bayesian calibration also with a time series that you saw before of all the archaeologically dated radiocarbon, cultural contexts from the various sites along the valley. So we had these 2 sequences, one cultural and one natural, and we had the interbedded charcoal. Okay, dated charcoal-rich deposits from the sampled localities indicate peak fire activity that occurred between 1350 and 1650 AD, with evidence of post-fire erosion beginning as early as AD 1050. So post-fire erosion is a signal of prairie fire. It does not happen in other fire contexts. For example, fire pits or hearts, or the burning of the carcasses, or the burning of the stomach contents of the carcass. That does not produce that kind of signature. Only a prairie fire can actually produce post-fire erosion in a particular sediment. That is really important as a unique signature of prairie fire as opposed to other kinds of fire. These dates, of course, overlaps with those originated from the archaeological contexts. And it is really important to understand that this particular fire sequence, this behavior, is actually unique in the Holocene, in this region. It doesn't happen before, 1250 to 1300, and it does not happen after 1650. It further coincides with the onset of the Little Ice Age, which expanded the grassland and attracted a lot more bison. It created fuel for fires, and ends when the sites are decommissioned due to the arrival of the horse. So it isn't that mounted Blackfoot didn't use fire. They simply didn't use it in the same localities or with the same frequency. And again, that may be due to the fact that they had two major animals that competed for pasture, and they had to completely change their grassland interaction to actually fit in these two. The last more important thing that you really have to pay attention is the bottom graph. The bottom graph is the Halmer index of severe drought for the last millennia, right? When you look at that particular graphic, you can see that around the medieval warmth that you mentioned, right? You can see that there's a little bit more drought than wet periods. But once these sites begin to be occupied and designed and built and used intensively for bison hunting, you can see pretty much not very much difference. You see the decadal cycles of wet and dry periods coming in. You cannot attribute to climate and climate change the process that we are seeing in the archaeological record. Climate, of course, fostered the pattern, culturally, technologically, and naturally by creating fuel, but did not affect, it was not a major factor in this particular behavior. What caused these fire sequences, therefore, can only be interpreted as anthropogenic fires. The location of these fires, when we analyze very carefully, the location of these fires can be interpreted in two ways. For the first, they can be interpreted as the ancestral Blackfoot used the fire as a mechanism to mobilize and attract bison herds into their farms. Alternatively, although not terribly exclusively, they also could have used fire to burn certain areas to either encourage or discourage bison to come into certain areas, so that they encourage this pyric herbivory behavior of bison, which is very typical of bison and also in other racers. So to conclude, interpreting these particular patterns, the antiquity of fire practices in the northern plains, which we know start at the very least 2,400 years ago, is a testament to the unique relationship that bison hunters had with their prey and their environment. Early in the development of specialized bison hunting, fire was implemented as one of several crucial tools for gaining control over the movement of bison, and as a consequence, for increasing the human carrying capacity of the northern grasslands. And you can tell when the combination of technologies of managing bison, storing food, and burning the prairie begin to actually reflect in the number of archaeological sites and in the number of animals killed, which is what the yellow line is showing you, but unfortunately something happened to my line on the vertical side, so you cannot see that very clearly there. The findings from our pyroarchaeology study reveal a direct correlation between the rise of intensive communal hunting during the last millennium and prairie fires. Furthermore, geoarchaeology indicates that post-fire erosion began and stopped in tandem with the construction and the commissioning of the vast pedestrian hunting complexes located along the two Medicine rivers. When combined with our extensive evidence of meat processing for long-term storage, the record of anthropogenic fires in the valley's hunting complexes is further evidence of the ancestral Blackfoot's ability to transform their landscape in order to plan for the future. As noted in our previous publications, planning, which involves not only the strategic adoption of certain technologies, but also the development of a calendar and the formation of institutions of social control, in turn indicates that the
You're gonna be, that must be the last one.
All right. Oh, okay. All right. Last paper for today, and comparing them in terms of ownership, management, education projects, and storytelling. Well, some heritage studies. So I'm sure this will reflect in the presentation. The site of Head Smashed in Buffalo Jump. So that's just some information for you beforehand. All right. So Head Smashed in Buffalo Jump, located in the Porcupine Hills of southern Alberta, is one of the oldest, largest, and best preserved buffalo jumps in North America. Because of its extraordinary archaeological, historical, and ethnographical value, combined with its prairie setting and outstanding interpretive potential, it was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1981. Inscribed under Criterion 6, which recognizes its direct association with the survival of the human race during the prehistoric period, this site is an outstanding illustration of the subsistence hunting techniques of Plains nations. Layers of bison bone buried up to 10 meters below the cliff represent nearly 6,000 years of use of the buffalo jump by Aboriginal people. Covering 1,470 acres, this site is composed of 4 distinct components. That is the gathering basin, the V-shaped drive lanes, the cliff hillside, and the campsite and processing area. Each part having different archaeological remains associated with communal buffalo hunting, ranging from drive lane cairns and projectile points to butchered bone and fire-broken rock. The site exemplifies the culture and society of the Plains Indians for many centuries before the European settlement of the region, and thus represents a complex range of indigenous identities, ideologies, and social relations. As a World Heritage Site, it is among a list of more than 1,000 locations worldwide that are regarded as the world's most outstanding attractions and the greatest cultural and natural sites on Earth. Since 1972, UNESCO has been seeking to encourage the identification, protection, and preservation of cultural and natural heritage around the world, considered to be of outstanding value to humanity. Its universal application makes the concept of World Heritage exceptional. World Heritage Sites are meant to belong to all the people of the world, irrespective of the territory on which they are located. They are perceived by tourists as places of superior significance, and the stories they narrate and the information passed on about people and their past are perceived worldwide. Consequently, besides having a symbolically highly significant status, cultural World Heritage is being valued for its educational aspects. It informs and educates local, regional, and international communities about the past, present, and future of peoples and societies associated with the site. For indigenous people, cultural heritage is essential to the restoration and permanence of their cultural distinctiveness. And the concept of World Cultural Heritage is meant to support the empowerment and capacity building of First Nations communities that are linked with the World Heritage Site. Examining the site of Head Smashed in Buffalo Jump, I argue that such aspects as ownership, control, and indigenous community involvement have significant implications and consequences for indigenous empowerment and capacity building, as well as on the modes and contents of the site's storytelling. So in the following paper, I will take a closer look at the government-owned site of Head Smashed in Buffalo Jump and explore the participation of the local indigenous population in the administration and operation of the site. Let me tell you a little bit about indigenous empowerment and capacity building before we actually take a look at the site. Well, there are many controversial and sensitive issues regarding ownership and control, management and community involvement, interpretation and representation of heritage. Ownership and control are inevitably linked with education and empowerment, since the owner determines what and how heritage is being protected and what stories are being told. When one culture decides what is significant and worth protecting in the cultural heritage of another, there's always the possibility of injustice arising. While the argument has been made that cultural heritage belongs to the public and, as Michael Ash puts it, well, it should be used for the greater good of contributing to the knowledge of humankind, end quote, many indigenous peoples assert that increased protection and control of cultural heritage, significant to them, is fundamental to the continuity, revival, and survival of their cultural identity. In Canada, the final authority to control cultural heritage is divided between the federal and provincial governments. Since First Nations are not provinces, the law assumes that they do not have the legitimate right to ultimate authority over decisions that affect their heritage. However, more and more First Nations are taking control of their heritage, and Indigenous empowerment through heritage, that is the increasing awareness of spiritual, political, social, racial, educational, gender, and economic strength of individuals and communities is gaining importance. Empowerment also means participation, education, and opportunities to use the acquired knowledge in a way contributive to society, and thus linking the acquisition of knowledge and skills to social needs and mobilization. The link that bounds heritage and indigenous communities is related to spiritual values, historical significance, and traditional occupations. Heritage thus holds a strong connection with identity and individual and collective memories that are formed, among others, by historic environments containing an infinity of ancient and recent stories written in stone or wood or inscribed in the features of the landscape that become the focus of community identity and pride. Heritage sites thus also provide mnemonic features as Janet Armstrong, Keith Basso, Callum Calloway, Hartmut Lopes, and others express. Communities must therefore participate in the decision-making process, which involves more than consultation, as Claudia Notzka argues. Processes must be initiated to ensure that communities are able to manage their own growth and resources sensibly. Project managers must identify local leaders. Local organizations must get involved. Key priorities of the community must be identified. And ideas, expectations, and concerns of the local people must be met. Organizations in charge of the preservation of the heritage site must consider integrating the indigenous communities in this process. UNESCO meets this demand with its mission of encouraging the participation of the local population in the preservation of the heritage. Now, the practical application of this objective, however, looks very different from site to site. Furthermore, Cultural World Heritage has the obligation to teach about indigenous culture and current problems in society. It has the responsibility to tell not only stories about the past, but also about the present, and thus help shape the future. Now let us take a look at the World Heritage Site in Boljan. Explored first in 1938 by members of the American Museum of Natural History, since the 1950s, Headsmashed in Vatlajab has been the objective of systematic excavations which have considerably enriched the knowledge of prehistoric arms and tools and transformed current thinking on the use of game as food and in clothing and lodging. After the government had purchased the land from proprietors who had ranched it for decades, Headsmashed in Vatlajab was designated a Canadian National Historic Site in 1968, a Provincial Historic Site in 1979, and a World Heritage Site in 1981. To tell the story of the Plains Hunters, a $9.8 million interpretive center was built in 1987, depicting and interpreting on 5 levels the ecology, mythology, lifestyle, and technology of Black peoples within the context of archaeological evidence. In addition to the exhibitions, the 10-minute documentary film In Search of the Buffalo is shown at the theater throughout the day, featuring a reenactment of a buffalo drive and related activities. Furthermore, the permanent photo exhibition Lost Identities, A Journey of Rediscovery, features Blackfoot people of different communities, and the gift store sells Blackfoot arts and crafts and souvenir items. While most visitors explore the exhibitions on their own, a guided facility tour leads through the center, the theater, and the Cliff Top Trail, introducing Blackfoot culture and history and the mechanics of the buffalo jump. Blackfoot interpreters guide the tour and offer information. For students, specific educational programs are provided designed to complement the Alberta learning curriculum. Head Smashed in Buffalo Jump is owned, controlled, and managed by the government of Alberta, with only minimal Indigenous involvement in the executive decision-making process. Holding the majority of jobs at the center, however, including those as site interpreters, the Blackfoot play a key role in the operation of the site. Currently, there are 6 governmental staff positions: the position of site manager, head of finances and visitor services, and head of education are filled by non-Indigenous employees. And Picanee are holding the positions of site marketing and program coordinator, head of interpretation, and lead guide. Additionally, Picanee contractors are hired as interpreters and as employees working in the gift shop, at the front desk, and as extra staff in the summer as they are what people want to see. As Head Smashed In is a government-run facility, government rules apply. Concepts of Indigenous time, spiritual values, and traditional practices have thus to be forsaken in favor of Western management concepts, as Catherine Bell observes, which seems to make working together sometimes challenging for both sides. When it comes to operations, marketing, and educational programs, Blackfoot knowledge is taken into consideration, and Blackfoot staff influences decisions within their positions. As program coordinator Quentin Crowshoe argues, quote, "It's a place shared by the First Nations and the government of Alberta, who are stringent in what they do here because it's taxpayers' money, and so we have to follow those rules. But at the same time, it gives us the opportunity to share stories, knowledge, and ideas, to have input." End quote. While Crowshoe sees Head Smashed In as a cooperative facility, other Blackfoot oppose the current ownership and management and consider the site their tribal heritage. Some are thus rejecting the fact that, quote, "the government is draining money out of the region and of native culture," end quote, as Edwin Smollett argues. Head Smashed In is of great spiritual significance for the Blackfoot, as Indigenous culture is generally based on a long and intimate relationship with the land. So, in spite of government ownership, the Blackfoot have come to claim the site as their own, and it has become a place of weddings, funerals, medicine bundle openings, meetings of elders, and many other ceremonies that reflect the esteem in which the place is held. For a while the buffalo jump method was abandoned around 1850, the descendants of the Blackfoot have always resided within a few kilometers of the jump. Thus the knowledge of its existence and use, together with the traditions, were meticulously passed on to successive generations, and the jump has never ceased being a proud piece of the past for the local Blackfoot. For the government, though, the use of Head Smashed In as a community center is rather difficult, as the site has been designated as an archaeological site, as former regional director Ian Clark explains, and I quote, "One of my problems with the place is that it has become Blackfoot Cultural Center, and my sense is that it is not really that. It is a World Heritage Site because of the buffalo jump and what it means. And the buffalo jump and its content are more important than the chicken dance. The chicken dance is colorful, and it's an interesting representation of Blackfoot culture, but it doesn't tell us the whole element of what this place means." End quote. This conflict between the government and the Blackfoot partly originates in different views of the concept of archaeology and heritage. Designation of Head Smashed In is predominantly based on archaeology, and culture officially came in only in 1987 when the center opened. But archaeology is a Western concept containing both a record of the past and the interpretations and values that people today apply to that record. Many Indigenous people do not view archaeological artifact sites as things of the past, though, but as active elements of their contemporary world. These objects, Places and stories are valued as much for their heritage value as for, according to George Nicholas, being repositories of beings and powers of importance within their worldview. This has major implications for understanding the critical reactions that the Blackfoot and other indigenous communities have to archaeology, and it also identifies the need for alternative heritage management strategies. Blackfoot involvement with the site is important for the cultural and spiritual capacity building of the Blackfoot, as they keep a close relationship with their traditions and beliefs. While many Pekingese and Kainai have thus come closely involved with the center, there's also hesitation and critique among other Blackfoot who believe that the government is exploiting and utilizing indigenous knowledge, and who see Blackfoot contributions as a betrayal of their culture, as site interpreter Trevor Peter says. Many of my people feel I'm selling out our culture. They don't like that I'm working here. Others, however, believe it is important to share their knowledge, as Quentin Crozier explains. He says, I'm not selling out, I'm sharing. Of course, when I don't share, the colonialists are going to win. When the government developed the storylines for the galleries, they consulted Pekingese elders, but not the elders of the Siksika and Kainai, who believed that their people had built and used the buffalo jump every bit as much as the Pekingese, and who did not always agree with the stories of their fellow traditionalists of the Pekingese, as Jack Prince explains. This conduct again raises questions of who has the right to interpret another culture, and, according to Sebastian Brown, hence gain authenticity for one's case. This is also reflected in the guided tours. Although a general guideline exists for teaching the programs, each Blackfoot guide approaches the topic differently, and even though they are expected to talk about traditional culture and lifestyle only, the interpreters point out historical and current problems, challenges of the Blackfoot, and thus often put their jobs at the center in jeopardy. The various and partly controversial narratives of the Blackfoot as logically sensitive people, stereotypical Indians, people of the past, and contemporary custodians of their cultural heritage are being communicated through interpreting the site and thus by the stories told. These narratives are strongly affected by and dependent on ownership and control of the heritage, community involvement, and customers' expectations. As tourists are looking for authentic Indians, they are sometimes disappointed with the modern, non-authentic guides. What's more, during their visit, they do not learn about the location of Blackfoot reserves and the ownership and management of the site. A visitor survey that I conducted shows that about 1/3 of the visitors believe that the Blackfoot own the site and the building. Another third thinks that the government owns the building, and the rest believe that UNESCO owns the building. The stories told and the history is passed on not only to non-Indigenous visitors, but also to young Blackfoot, are important as children and youth learn through heritage about their tribes or people's history and traditions, and build up an understanding for their culture and identity. While there are many different educational programs offered to schools and youth groups, none of them are directed towards Indigenous people, young people only. On the contrary, as Hetzmecht is a governmental institution, many young Blackfoot oppose the involvement with it. Therefore, although the Pekingese and to some extent the Kainai have been involved with the site and their communities gain certain cultural, spiritual, and economic benefits, there's little to no socio-political empowerment aside for the Indigenous heirs of the ancient Buffalo. Let me come to a conclusion now. Heritage is our legacy from the past. What we live with today, what we pass on to future generations. It is an irreplaceable source of life and inspiration, according to UNESCO. Cultural heritage is also an important source of empowerment and capacity building for Indigenous communities. And the actions outside the boundaries of the heritage site affect the site's preservation, while communities are partners and protagonists in the conservation process. While Hetzmecht in Buffalo Jump is a popular tourist attraction along the Cowboy Trail of southern Alberta, visited by thousands of visitors each year and owned and managed by the government of Alberta, the situation of the Blackfoot is an unresolved political conflict and a legacy of colonialism. The land in southern Alberta was ceded through Treaty Number 6 and 7, and the treaty Indians involved have different bargaining positions than non-treaty Indians, which is the case at Skangwai, where I have done much research as well. The Blackfoot, therefore, have no legal title to the land and their ancestors, and to the site of Headstone, since it was negotiated at the time before the task force on Aboriginal languages and cultures. Since the Blackfoot do not own the land and have no authorized voice in the management, there is no co-management of the site, which again is the case at Skangwai in British Columbia. The site's attraction, however, depends significantly on Blackfoot presence and involvement in the operation of the site. This involvement, though, is not based on formal agreements with the Piikani or Kainai, as it is the case with Skangwai, but consists of the contributions of single Blackfoot in certain positions within the operation process. The attitude towards Head Special In, though, does not represent the position of the Blackfoot in general. Without official cooperation, there is no general employment policy for Blackfoot and no revenues that go to the indigenous community. Moreover, important improvement in indigenous employment, living conditions, and education, as well as identification, seems only to exist on an individual basis. While Blackfoot working as guides, dancers, or sales personnel at Head Smashed In identify with the site, there's little identification with the site among the area Blackfoot. Many visitors, however, believe that the Piikani are the owners and managers of the site, and thus cannot understand Blackfoot complaints about living circumstances, as they expect the indigenous communities to make use of revenues. For indigenous empowerment and capacity building through cultural world heritage, indigenous involvement in the decision-making process is essential. And for heritage preservation to succeed, it is also fundamental that all the stakeholders are involved in the process of conservation, including communities. Heritage, together with education, can become the basis for the construction of meanings and learnings. The visitor, however, must be able to read the context and reality that surrounds him, attributing sense to the learned contents in a way to endow significant meanings to it. This conception of heritage coincides with the basic human necessities of orientation and identity, creating vital relations of man with environment, with sense and order to the world. In this context, it becomes essential that the stories about indigenous people at the sites are told from an indigenous perspective. As mentioned, indigenous storylines about the contemporary situation of the Blackfoot need to be included, as heritage always educates about the present as well as about the past. Thus, heritage, as Leslie Agoda says, needs to be moving forward, creatively redefining itself, seeking engagement in critical agendas relating to conflict resolution, intercultural dialogue, and poverty reduction. The challenge of storytelling and education also shows that tangible and intangible cultural heritage cannot be looked at separately. For material culture can only be understood and appreciated in the context of the appropriate knowledge of the natural world, with all the narratives that come with it. The ways intangible properties are valued, and thereby order social behavior, is of vital importance for the relationships between people that intangible property engages. Understanding and protecting tangible and intangible cultural heritage requires a systemic approach. And cultural protocols around the regulation of traditional knowledge are inherent in traditional knowledge systems. Only then the expected teaching can follow. And only then cultural world heritage, fundamental to the continuity, revival, and survival of indigenous cultural identity, will be an asset in the empowerment and capacity building of Native Americans in a challenging and demanding post-colonial world. Thank you.
Just pull the, on the side, on the website, just pull the, yeah. There we go. Thank you. Yeah, please.
Well again, another great set of papers. It's a remarkable set of bookends for the full trajectory of Blackfeet culture and history, and particularly in forms of the expression of community heritage. I have a feeling the organizers had something to do with that. But I think they inform one another and address a number of common topics and themes. I think that the archaeological analysis reported by Maria is top rate. I mean, it combines such a broad suite of quantitative and scientific methods brought to bear on issues and problems that have been of concern and interest to scholars in a number of disciplines for a very long time. I was so happy I made the comments about horses and pasturage, and to find out that pyroarchaeology, cutting edge work in that area, concurs with some of the things that we pondered several decades ago. I think that the discussion by Genevieve is critically important. The work that I have undertaken as a museum anthropologist working with indigenous communities, these issues of heritage are at the forefront of current dialogues with respect to intellectual property and issues of intellectual sovereignty, which is really where a lot of the conversation has come to be focused here in Oklahoma, particularly with respect to the ability of tribal nations to assume responsibility for image making and to take control of their own identity construction, that we must make room for multiple interpretations of the past. I think that the issues of intellectual property and traditional ecological knowledge bridge these papers once again. This is obviously a consistent theme in the work that you've reported to us today. I think that the levels of analysis, really, I think is another one that oftentimes we tend to focus on the data itself and the theoretical umbrellas that bring our work together. But I think that we should highlight and make mention of the fact that these are both very in-depth and broad-based pieces of research. So that it's oftentimes, it's our approach and our orientation, our perspective, the methodologies that really reveal to us perhaps relationships among our respective research trajectories that might not otherwise be forthcoming. The work by pyroarchaeologists, I find this fascinating. Having lived on the plains and in prairie environments and worked closely with Native communities, these conversations about burning arise in multiple occasions, and I'll touch on a few here at the end of my comments. I'm amazed and greatly informed by the diversity of outcomes from the application of prescribed burns. I would love to hear more about collecting insects using fire. We've known for a very long time that it was a very effective weapon in intertribal disputes with respect to resource allocation, that burning the grass in one area had great benefits for unburned other areas within territories that particular tribal communities might control. Genevieve's work at Head Smashed In and the relationship between indigenous peoples and archaeology is another area that I think is oftentimes overlooked, in that indigenous people have a very keen interest in their history and are very focused on the ways in which oral tradition and community heritage intersects with the work of scientific archaeology. And oftentimes I think that it feeds both sides of that equation, in that it informs indigenous people, but also their interpretations, particularly when they are able to relate the remains that archaeologists uncover to their mythic histories and their stories of Genesis and early organization, that oftentimes we find congruence there that at first glance we might find to be quite fleeting. So I encourage everyone to consider incorporating those sources of information into your analyses. I think archaeology and the construction of modern identities, oftentimes the dialogue becomes entrenched in differences of interpretation. And while indigenous perspectives and interpretations of the archaeological record may not be directly relevant to the sites that are under discussion at the time, the general patterns and the general trends that they reveal through these oral traditions can be quite informing, even if they don't provide direct evidence for the interpretation of a particular set of archaeological data. They can certainly inform broader levels of theory. And I think there are multiple examples of that today. I know my own work being fortunate to go into the field with archaeologists, particularly with the spiral mounds complex, the same issues that you uncovered with respect to ownership of the past, not only between settler colonialism and indigenous groups, but among indigenous groups, the Caddo and Wichita, both of whom we interpret spiral mounds in the eastern part of the state as being Proto-Caddoan, so that both of those historically known groups have affinity to that site and have different interpretations of it, that again, the combination of them have informed archaeological work in that area to a tremendous extent. I think that, back to Genevieve's work, that I'm a huge fan of Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett, who says that heritage is really things that are made today, the things that we create today that have recourse to the past, that heritage is a value-added entity, phenomenon, in that it enriches both our understanding of the past, but also is critically important, as you very adequately point out, that it's critically important and central to the modern identity constructions of these groups. I think that why not incorporate Native interpretations into our work? The power of oral tradition has never ceased to amaze me. I think that one of the issues here that brings a new dimension into this are these issues of hierarchies and power relationships, as far as who's actually making these decisions. As a museum anthropologist, this is central to my work. Whose perspective is being represented, the politics of cultural and historical representation, issues of voice, issues of diversity of opinion. We tend to overestimate and overemphasize these sort of homogenous interpretations of the past that nothing could be further from the truth. Indigenous communities today display an incredible range of diversity of opinion and perspective in the interpretation of their respective histories. I think that one of the things that resonated with me listening to Maria's paper is the ceremonial expression of subsistence practices. This is something that I think anthropologists and related disciplines have largely ignored. Your reference to the Sundance and the ritual burning is fascinating, in that we know that particularly tribes on the plains who came to be focused for brief periods of time on intensive Sundance ceremonialism, that oftentimes a range of domestic and subsistence practices were part of that ceremonialism, that it provided supernatural sanction for the perpetuation of division of labor according to gender and social group, that all of these are played out within ceremonial situations. And oftentimes it's when sacred relationships between humans and animals, between natural phenomena like fire, are explained within these settings. So it's important to incorporate them also into our thinking. And then lastly, commenting on Genevieve's paper again, this modern identity construction that's taking place in indigenous communities, the importance of place, the power of ownership, and the sovereignty of interpretation of the past are critical elements in the modern lives of Native peoples. The added value of heritage is undeniable. And to build a $10 million interpretive site, I've been to that location. It's not exactly on a major byway that's going to attract hundreds of thousands of individuals, but nevertheless, in the economic circumstances that you framed on the Blackfeet Nation and its associated communities, even at this level of economic opportunity, is a critically important potential resource for the community. I think that the introduction of community agendas with respect to economic development, culturally based education, and political autonomy are critical for the future of these sites. And that it's the work of scholars such as ourselves that bring thinking from the environmental studies, from scientific archaeology, from history, ethnohistory, our work in ethnology with contemporary and cultural studies with contemporary Native communities, enrich not only the work that we undertake, but can be reciprocal and feedback into those source communities. So again, a fantastic set of papers, and I thank you for your time. Turn it over.
Questions for our presenters or for our competent?
So I have a question for Genevieve, and it's around your framing of the project in terms of empowerment and capacity, which is really interesting. In the Canadian context, much of what you're talking about gets framed now through this idea of reconciliation, particularly through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is sponsored by the federal government to as a kind of post-colonial moment to heal those relationships, which has been largely because it's sponsored by the state. People are reacting against that through what some people are calling a politics of recognition. And it's given rise to a whole body of scholarship, particularly in Indigenous studies, where scholars are calling for Indigenous resurgence, and they're framing kinds of things you're talking about in different terms. So I'm wondering if that complicates the empowerment dynamic a little bit, and if you can comment on that in terms of the site that you're talking about.
Yeah, you're right. I know there's this whole reconciliation process going on for the past years. And I still kept these terms that I'm using because there's this complication of what do people what are people drawn at, what do they oppose? So I see that. I'm not quite sure yet whether I keep these terms or whether I will change the terms, because empowerment is you can also think of 60s empowerment. It's a pretty critical term. So I'm not quite sure if I'm going to stick to that or if I reframe it or rename it. I think it's really a question of definition and what I mean by it. And it's really this what I want to look at is the capacity building within the nation, the respective tribes, and look at that in terms of financial and educational and social capacity building, if you want. What kind of education do they gain from it? So all these questions. But you're right. I'm not done yet with naming or terming, sticking to terms or changing the process.
Thanks.
George, please.
I had a couple questions for Maria. Maria. It's great to have a fire specialist too.
Not me.
I wonder if you could speak to whether in your paper you talk about the cooler, wetter climate allowing fescue to thrive, and therefore the fire to exist for burning. Would the same conditions also act with dispersed fires and require more management on the part of the region? So two effects happening at the same time. Fire possible, but also with cooler and wetter climate, you also have the need for more management. What are your thoughts about that? And the other question was whether there's any archaeology around the detractor fires and whether they would be so dispersed and so it'd be like a needle in a haystack trying to find evidence of this. Is there any evidence to really round out that model that you're citing?
Evidence of
spring firing to stop by from moving into other areas? Is this just costly working altogether?
Well, I think that the Manitoba example
But that's
is a very good example. But there's there's very few studies. There may be 2 or 3 at most. That's why, you guys are having like original data that's never before been published on this study. You have the not technical version, right? Because I could not possibly explain to you the technical version. So, but there are too few studies. And one of the difficulties is that you really need to be able to clearly associate sites with fire to actually create a proxy for anthropogenic fires. That was the problem, for example, that Boyd found, because he did not have the charcoal sequences that we do. I mean, if you look at our charcoal sequences, they look like we painted them on the picture. They don't look, they look so perfect, they are almost unreal. Whereas he was working with grass remains, phytoliths, which are the silica, the silica part of the plant, of the seed, the grass seed, that does not decay. And he was working with grass remains that had evidence of having been burned that were actually associated with an archaeological sequence. So that is a different methodology than the one we used. We did the phytolith work, and it was very useful for us to tell that the fires had been, for the most part, in the samples that we can actually recover the phytoliths, there have been done after the seeding process, after the grass is seeded, which means we're probably fires after the rut in the late summer, early fall, for spring recovery, which is really important for keeping your pregnant cows from calving in the broad prairie, when you cannot actually help them and you cannot actually monitor the little guys, right? So that is a problem in the issue of reconstructing broad patterns. I mean, we're talking about these sites, the gathering basins are huge. I mean, if the site itself, the actual archaeological site, is, 20 square kilometers, the milling areas go beyond those 20 square kilometers, and we would have to look into certain features, like ancient wallows, for example, would be a good place to look. Maybe ancient lakes that are in the middle of these gathering basins that were really used, like very important to bison. Well, those would be very good to sample, because those sediments do not, especially on the small lakes, those sediments are very stable. They are not being disturbed. The wallows are not so good because they are disturbed also. But there are other places where we can actually look at. It's just a matter of systematically sampling. For example, between 2 drainages, like we could do a sample between 2 Medicine and Badger Creek, which is the immediate drainage to the south, because we know that at Badger Creek there are other archaeological sites, other jumps, and that the backside of our jump went all the way to the creek, so it connected the 2 drainages. So if we could actually backtrack the sampling and move from one drainage to the next and stop in these little lakes. There's one particular site, Strangleable. It has 17 water bodies in the gathering basin. That's a lot of places to sample. It would be great. So that is something that, Chris and I have to put our heads together and develop a sampling, develop a project and an idea and a sampling system, and actually get a grant to do it, which I don't think would be that hard. That's why Chris is like an incredibly brilliant person I've known, and a great scientist. But that would be something in the long term to be done, and I think it would be fantastic. It would resolve this issue, right? And now, of course, like there have been fire retractors, but detractors, there were a lot of people who work in these sites and saw the fire, saw that the deposits were burned, thought that they were lighting fires. But in fact, historical data show you that less than 10% of European observations of fire on the plains, grassland fires, are actually attributed to natural causes. Some are accidental, people accidentally burn more than they wanted to burn, but entirely natural fires are very rare in the historic record, which in fact tells you that people were the responsible, agents of fire in the Permian. And that I think is one of the most important recent pieces of information that have come out of this increasing body of research that I was talking about, fire.
Whether fairly recent past, a lot more recent than what Marie is talking about, but there was a geographer who studied eyewitness accounts to fire back in, I think 1972, I think it was in Berkeley, and, used seasonal kind of analysis of when those fires were, and found very few fires in the summer months, which is when the prominent lightning time is. There were accidental burns and purposeful burns both in the fall and in the spring for the reasons that, bison-oriented reasons that she talked about. So I wish I would have had your research when I did mine, because it was fascinating, and it really would have kind of pushed my analysis back, helped me push that back further than I was able to go. But really
George,
interesting
you asked me a second question, and I'll answer you very briefly. That it was about the issue of the Little Ice Age and the expansion of grassland. But when you look at it the way you did, over a continental setting, you see general trends, but you also see like population trends specifically, but you also see local impacts that differ from one region to another. If you look at Wyoming, there was no bison in Wyoming. Pretty much very little bison in Wyoming, because they were moving north where these fescue grasses were growing. Wyoming is not a fescue province. The bison you find them in the Mississippi River, and the sort of, like describing guys walking around in the tall grass. So that kind of pattern needs to be explained locally. And in the case of the Northwestern Plains, I think that the expansion of the fescue province attracted bison and provided a great opportunity for people to actually increase production. But there's also other factors. You have to factor in the expansion of trade, the trade networks that you talked about, that encourage people to actually produce more for exchange. You have to factor in historical contingency factors, as defense and other groups coming in trying to get at these greater bison fields and bison pastures. And the boundary formation, it's also really important. The territorial circumscription and the need to produce intensively in a smaller area. Like at the very beginning of the late prehistoric period, the archaeological signature of the Blackfoot, which is the old women's space materials and architecture, extended almost through 3/4 of Saskatchewan. But by 1300, that boundary had retracted toward where it was, defined at the time of, European contact, or, the time of the purchase of the land, of Rupert's land. So yeah, I mean, those boundaries that you talk about, that they were getting fire, made people produce in a more circumscribed environment.
Other questions? Yes, Nicole, please.
I just have a question. Is you said that the dumping sites were abandoned at 60 years now?
Yeah, we have some dates that some of them were repaired.
Isn't that a bit early for horse, or?
Well, no, the peak use of these sites is 16.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. The horse came in 1730, but they were still using those sites on food. I think that there were other population demographic processes that were impacting the use of these sites that, another conversation. But it's like a constellation of things, that are, but they were definitely completely decommissioned by the early 1800s. Yeah. Yeah, they were still used as of 1791, but soon after that, they were used less and less and less.
Nicole, please.
I'm curious, Maria, and maybe Genevieve a little bit as well. I'm curious about the issue of control, because it seems like, despite the fact that we're using controlled fires and that you have cairns directing bison to do the jumps, and that the processing was very sophisticated, both of you are sort of attacking common narratives like the ecological Indian, or the idea that everything was used, every last piece of a bison was used. But to what degree were they able to control the number that were directed over the cliff? Were trade networks developed well enough that all the pieces of the bison that were processed from pemmican and so forth being used within, for example, the Blackfeet themselves, and then traded out to other groups of people as well? And from what I understand, George, of your work, you probably could speak to this a lot as well. I had trouble processing a lot of, especially the archaeological evidence and stuff, but it was impressive. But I'm curious to know what's being done also, how this impacts our understanding of Blackfeet and larger Native American groups as well.
Well, from the archaeological perspective, the ecological area does not exist. Period. And the only reason there's no bison bone on the northern plains is because they were collected in the 1930s in forests for fertilizer and during the World War II weapons industry. Brandy Belke, who works now there, the Home Archaeological Survey, she unearthed historic photographs of Blackfoot camps before the bone collectors came, and they were littered with bison bone. And even so using every part of the bison, not way. Otherwise, we wouldn't have any archaeology today. All right. So that was the first question, right? The second question is trade. We're beginning to have evidence that people from the Middle Missouri were, in fact, in the heart of Blackfoot territory. They were probably either farming or bringing in corn and bringing in things from that area, from the Middle Missouri. They also had some, the Blackfoot were using Knife River flint from the Middle Missouri from the beginning of time, right? That was a major thing that they would trade. And corn is a little bit more difficult to find, but we're finding evidence of corn. It's just that the technology is improving. So yeah, trade was a big deal in the overproduction, in the intensity of production. But the other thing is that with the expansion of the grassland and the bison herds coming in, a lot of people that were dispersed around the territory that lived at the foot of the Rocky Mountains, that lived on areas that were not very, that were not as many resources to the east, they all started to aggregate and come and flock into a smaller and smaller area. So you had progressively more people, less area, and you had to produce more. You had to feed a band. There were 3 bands living in certain times in the Medicine River. And each band probably ranged from 300 to 500 people, probably on average 300. Those were almost 1,000 people that you had to feed with these particular sites. And the Blackfoot did not hunt any other thing except for hide. That is what specialization means. They did hunt other animals, but not in any quantity that you would find in a float.
Well, maybe I can add to that, what Maria just said. Of course, they did not always use everything. Sometimes they just butchered the bison lightly. They just took out the tongues, and that was it, right? Because there were just so many. And the other thing is, whether they could control it. Once they were actually being tricked, they had to be killed, right? Because they would tell the other bison about the trick, right? And so that the food source would not come anymore to that cliff. So you had to switch on if they experienced trick. It's very interesting because of the intelligence that was ascribed to the animals, right? Communicating with each other and telling the other animals about the cliff, and
So assuming
Humanized
there's a
almost.
need to rotate sites on a regular basis almost, in a sense, so that, just like a particular crop shouldn't stay in one place because the insects will attract to that particular space, not that there's a complete equivalency here, then you would have to then change the sites, where the kill sites on a regular basis, so that the herds wouldn't be aware that, oh, this is what's about to take place. Is that?
Well, I
True-
think,
true
I think,
at all?
I mean, this was really continuously used for the past 6,000 years, and that they found like 10 meters high of bones. So that was, that's how many they were just left rot there.
Right.
So, well, I think they were continuously using it.
Yeah, please.
So thank you, Leah. I like how you're framing the, again, food production as a, systematic method. Yeah, this is another systematic method, rotation. I don't kind of have a line that, talk about it that way. Kind of thinking about crops, thinking about harvesting, using that in the pastoral, using that language. So definitely, I think it depends on the environment, depends on the resource, and again, it's historically and geographically.
Yes, please.
One more quick one.
You've got the last question, Cliff.
Okay.
No pressure.
This for Genevieve. I just wanted to ask how you might consider engaging. What frustrated me about the contemporary issues that Black people are dealing with is this constant clash between Western science and this kind of broad value to quote humanity as evinced in this UNESCO site, as kind of sweeping indigenous rights and sovereignty under the rug in favor of this kind of humanitarian story, or this kind of value to world global culture, if you will, human importance. And so that made me think of Kennewick Man and the debate that went on with that. It's such a, even today, still kind of a sore spot in terms of the relationship between Western scientific, archaeological science and indigenous peoples' rights, as far as how there's different ways of relating to things that are seen in completely different lights from these different perspectives. And so I just wanted to ask if you kind of reflected on that, and again, just from the very outset, thinking about this universal belonging and questioning the UNESCO World Heritage Sites and how they kind of undercut sovereignty issues.
I'm gonna cut this off here. That's an interesting question. When I'm in the process of preparing different slides, right, different UNESCO slides, and when I looked at, that's probably off, not the plane, but when I looked at the co-managed sites, they are not, very, very, very few. It's not, there's Tapahana on Hawaii, which is co-managed, and there is Hawaii. And that is really interesting from the perspective of, what voice do the indigenous people whose heritage it is, what voice do they have in, terms of how many visitors are supposed to be on our site? When is the site being traveled on and destroyed? How much, what are we going to do with the revenues? How much money goes into education programs for our young people, and so on and so forth. What kind of stories are being told? Who's telling the stories? Is it really the hideout, or in this case the Black people who are telling the stories, or who's doing the storylines, right? So those are the issues I'm looking at, and that's where it is really interesting. What UNESCO is not providing money in any way. UNESCO is just giving this designation sign, which is drawing visitors, yes, but UNESCO is not such a big name in North America as it is in Europe. There, UNESCO is really a thing for tourism, which is not the case in North America. Here, it's a national historic site, or not. That's the big deal. But the reason why I'm looking at UNESCO sites and is really what are their conventions? How are they changing throughout the past decades? Their view on culture, how are they defining, what is of outstanding universal value, and how do they bring in indigenous people? And that's really within the past 10 years or so, maybe a bit more. Their perspectives have changed quite a bit. So that's what I'm focusing on and looking at and checking that perspective. I couldn't really include in the short presentation now, but that's my starting point, my kind of perspective on the whole issue.
All right, well, first, thank you to Dan and Genevieve and Maria for